So this is really a tables turn day here. Ernie and I met, how many years ago?
7 or 8 at least, yeah.
At least, I think it's been longer than that. And he's always interviewing me. He works with Reuters. He's a journalist. And so today I'm interviewing him. And the thing he wrote the book about has been my life. I mean, the war below has been the war internationally, but working with communities, dealing with environmental issues, permitting, and all so forth, that's Freeport. And so I've been giving lectures not to talk too much, Ernie, because I could really get off on that. So here we are in New Orleans. Freeport, company that I'm chairman of now, has a long history in this area. The roots go real deep. It was once a sulfur mining company formed in New York in the early 1900s. Port Sulphur is a company town. Freeport, Texas is a company town. And, and then our headquarters moved here in the mid-'80s for Freeport. And we were here until 2007 when we moved to Phoenix and acquired a much larger company there and became more of a, kind of created the modern Freeport. Our roots here go back to McMoran exploration. I moved to New Orleans in 1970. McMoran was in the Pierre Marquette building, had 16 employees. Kevin Althans is here somewhere, and his father and I were just like this in those early days. 16 employees. Today we have 70,000 workers globally. And so the world has really changed. To set the stage for Ernie, I think, particularly since we're in New Orleans, to give kind of a framework, we have natural resources. Oil and gas is one important segment of that, particularly in this area with the oil and gas background. And then internationally, globally, I mean, petroleum started world wars and critical to everybody's economy. And you had the predominance of the cartel in the Middle East. The second basic group that I'd refer to are the industrial metals. Copper is a big industrial metal, but you also have aluminum, nickel, zinc, lead, big industrial metals. Now we have, of growing importance, a group of specialty metals that lithium, part of the title of this book, is a key one. Those include battery metals, but also what's called rare earth metals, which are increasingly important and to countries, and that has changed so much. So those are the three basic categories. And I like to think of natural resources, but particularly the metals industry, which we're into, as having three eras. Going back historically, they were tracked, the demand tracked the global economic cycle. Copper is the commodity that's most closely correlated with industrial production. And so before the early 2000s, these metals would track the business cycle. Then China emerged in just an unexpected and critical way. And it turned the world of metals upside down. The price of copper had for years ranged right around 70 cents a pound, and everybody thought it was going to stay roughly in that range. Within 2 years, it went to $4. And as we sit here today, it's between $4.50 and $5. So China changed everything. Our company produces more copper, for example, than China does as a country. And yet they consume almost 60% of the world's copper. And so that positions them to do anything. Now we have a new era of copper metals that's really driven by electricity. 2/3 of copper goes into generating, transmitting, or using electricity. And you all know just how important, how much more electrical the world has gotten and is getting to be. And these resources are very difficult to find. I've been the biggest seller of this book since I read it the first time. Ernie, and we have similarities. We're both trained as accountants, both went into oil and gas. I was in Houston in the 80s, and Ernie got signed by Reuters to oil and gas initially, and now we ended up focusing on the same area of these industrial metals. But so, Ernie, why don't you add to whatever you want to about your background?
Sure.
And talk about how this led into this great book. And the book, I really encourage you to read it because it's very readable. Ernie's a journalist, and he doesn't write it as an advocate. He really, what's so good about it is you cover both sides of these issues, both in terms of the policymakers and the companies' desires or need to develop resources, and then communities' issues with having those developed in ways that affect communities. And so you read it, and it's so educational, and he writes clearly. It's not something that's a strain to read, so I congratulate you, Ernie.
Thank you.
For that.
It's great to be with you, Richard, and Cheryl, and everyone here at the festival today. And the tables are turned, so this is a unique situation for me. I've interviewed Richard a lot over the years. I started my career covering oil and gas, as Richard was saying, and I joined the organization I work for now, Reuters, in New York City. I was writing a lot in 2008, 2009 about this thing called fracking. It wasn't a swear word, but at the time everyone thought it was. And spent a lot of time in Ohio and Pennsylvania writing about how fracking was really changing those states' economies. But then we could see the fracking wave getting much more intense, and my bosses came to me one day in 2014, and they said, "We have an offer you can't refuse. We're going to send you to North Dakota." And I said, who did I, anger or piss off or something? And they said, no, this is a good thing. And so I spent 2 years living in North Dakota as part of a one-person assignment, writing about how fracking was making North Dakota one of the biggest oil-producing regions in the world, billions of dollars flowing through the state. My rent in North Dakota was more than double what I was paying in New York City. So I think it goes to show you the supply-demand imbalance there. OPEC ministers were routinely lobbing insults at the governor of North Dakota. It was great. I loved it as a journalist. But then, 2 years in North Dakota was enough, and then I moved to Houston, where I live now, and writing about Exxon and Chevron and OPEC. But then I became very curious about this electrification trend that Richard is talking about this new wave of demand for not only copper, but other industrial metals. So I switched my focus to look at mining, and so I dove into it, and that's how Richard and I first met. The book really is an outcrop of a lot of the reporting that I was doing for Reuters and for other places in there. And I noticed a lot of parallels right away, certainly between the oil and gas industry and the mining industry. Obviously, they're extractive. They obviously have large capital needs, et cetera, et cetera. But whereas a lot of people, especially in the United States, have very strong opinions on oil and gas, positive or negative, I think the average person, has a very, very strong feeling about some of these big oil companies. In general, mining is not really thought of in the United States, or at least fully formed out, fleshed opinions about what you think about extraction for these industrial metals.
Unless it's happening in your community.
Well, this is what I'm getting at, right? I mean, people say, sure, I think lithium's in my phone because there's a lithium-ion battery there, right? But as Richard said, when it comes to specific sources, when it comes to saying, hey, we're going to put a nickel mine where you went camping as a little girl, or we're going to dig for cobalt where your ancestors are buried and where you might have religious ceremonies, that's where the rub comes in. That's where the tension comes up. And so for me, the book explores this idea of choice. What are the choices we're willing to make if we want this electrified future? We all have tons of gadgets and gizmos in our houses today that are powered by lithium-ion batteries that weren't even 20, 30 years ago. So increasingly, we're using many more of these materials. They have to come from somewhere. If we're not comfortable having them extracted in our backyard, metaphorical or otherwise, are we comfortable having them extracted in places in the world with extremely low safety and ESG standards, and where some people can be killed as part of their production process? So these are the ideas that I wanted to bring to the reader. It is, yes, a book about mining, but it's so much more than that. It's a book about people, and I say the two main themes for me are community and choice.
Yeah, in the 80s, I was in Houston working with Mitchell Energy, George Mitchell, which actually started the shale revolution in the Fort Worth Basin.
Huge advancement, yeah.
Yeah, so it's been part of my life, and I saw how it transformed that industry, because before that, they were talking about peak oil. The U.S. was going to run out of oil. Now the U.S. is a major exporter. And there's another important difference between mining and oil and gas. Value is created in the oil and gas industry in broad terms with the discovery of resources. Very rare to find new mines. In our industry, our mine in Indonesia was discovered in 1988, and it's the most recent major discovery since then. Our value is created in developing resources and operating them efficiently, where value is created in the oil and gas business by finding resources. The margins between operating cost and sales price is much wider in the oil and gas industry than in our industry.
Right, right.
So one thing that's overhanging us right now, I feel like this book's been out forever, but it was only published in January 2004. And I think it's
24.
24. Just so,
If you're coming out for a 21-year-old book, thank you.
I'm an accountant, I can't keep up with numbers. And so just a little over a year ago,
A lot's changed, yeah.
a lot has changed. I mean, and it's changing every day. I mean, you know, I've been spending time in Washington, and it's like literally the old phrase of drinking out of a fire hydrant. I mean,
Not sure what you're referring to, Richard.
they call executive orders, and here, you know, see, but you know, we can blend that into the discussion. But I think this issue of choice and how projects affect communities and people, like you say. I mean, I love the story about the project in Nevada with the wildlife that only grows in lithium-rich soil. And
Yeah, I guess what I would say to that, Richard, is yes, there will be change, and certainly whoever's in the White House or whoever is going to be elected at any political office anywhere in the world will change. And what I wanted to bring to the reader was, as you say, this idea of choice, and to say that the specific projects that I write about in the book, they might have some resolution, whether that's in courts or they might not get the permits that they need, but each chapter looks at a specific, what I consider, tension point that we as the reader need to be exploring. So one big chapter talks about Indigenous rights. Do Indigenous rights matter more than our quest for copper and other critical minerals? And Richard's referring to, the wildflower he's referring to is a story that I use as the narrative spine of the book. About 200 miles north of Las Vegas, there's a vast lithium deposit that a company based in Australia would like to mine and sell to Ford and other automakers, as well as other manufacturers. The problem for this company, though, is that this site is home to a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet. And so if you dig the mine, would you basically relegate this flower to extinction? Should we care about the flower? Or should we care about the lithium? And if we do nothing, would the flower go extinct? So these are some of the issues. And at some point, that project will have resolution, something will happen there. But for me, the issue about does biodiversity matter more than our fight against climate change was something to bring to the reader and to say these are some of the issues that you need to explore. The book does talk a lot about what former President Biden did or didn't do, just because it was a product of its time, but I still think how we demand more from our elected officials, regardless of who's in the White House or who's sitting on Capitol Hill, is extremely important. And what I would say is that I purposely focused on projects in the United States. All but one I talk about in the book are in the United States, because I wanted us as Americans to really have to sit in this sticky situation and to almost stew in it and to say, what would we do if we were sitting in the White House or on Capitol Hill? How do we actually want the manufacturers that build the products we use every single day to source these metals? So that's what I wanted to do with the reader.
you know, next book, let's talk about international. So and these issues that Ernie's talking about are straightforward in a lot of ways intellectually. You can say we need these resources. You can point how the world's going, how the demand's growing, that we have critical needs for them. And yet, then when you get on the ground and try to do it, the whole thing changes dramatically. And we learned early on. I'm so old, y'all, even the ones from New Orleans will remember, but Freeport was once a company with a black hat on because of what we were doing with our phosphate mines in the Mississippi River and dumping in the river, and there was a byproduct or a waste product that was called toxic at the time, and big controversy here in New Orleans about it. After we sold the business, it was declassified, no longer considered toxic. And then we had a controversial project in Indonesia. We're in the U.S. in a big way. It's about a third of our global copper production, and yet Freeport produces almost 75% of the copper produced in the United States. We don't import or export out of the United States to speak of, and the rest of the copper needs is imported. The U.S. wants copper. We got big resources. We want to develop it. Very large employer in the Southwest, and yet it just takes so long. Permitting's a piece of it, sure. But just to design mines, do all the engineering work, all the water work, the environmental protection, and things like that. What we've learned, and it started with the experience we had in Indonesia. We have 30,000 people working in one of the remote places in the world, on the island of New Guinea, where we have the world's second largest copper mine, and gold is a byproduct. Most years, it's the largest gold mine in the world. And there's tremendous problems between the indigenous people who are racially different, culturally different, religiously different than the bulk of Indonesians. And so we had to learn to deal with that. And so what we have as our approach is to try to find common ground with people, to not dismiss people because of concerns about an endangered wildlife or flower, and to think about the impact you have on a community and so forth. And we've been successful with it. In fact, why don't you have a chapter in your book on our mine, Morenci. Why don't you say a couple of things about it?
Sure. Yeah, I think what Richard's getting at is how mines and mining companies interact with host communities is extremely important, and that is one of the themes that I push into in the book. I did spend a lot of time at proposed projects, as I said, across the country. One that does stand out to me is in North Carolina, where a company would like to develop a massive lithium mine that would supply Tesla. The company spent a lot of time going to Wall Street, talking to investors, talking to analysts about its project, spent a lot of time on CNBC and other financial television networks to basically talk up its project. Went to Elon Musk, got what's called an offtake agreement, basically a supply deal, and that allows them to go to the banks and get money to actually develop the mine. The problem, though, is that the company did all of this before it talked to the local community. And so people would, live next to neighbors for 30 years, and their neighbor would all of a sudden sell to this company, which was based in Australia, and they would call up their county commissioner and said, my neighbors just sold to this nameless, faceless behemoth that I know nothing about. What's going on? And the county commissioners would say, I don't know what's going on. And so that did not engender any trust at all, as you can imagine, regardless of the Tesla affiliation or the big offtake deal or any money from Wall Street for this more than $1 billion project. And so that was a theme that I really, really wanted to push into for the book, is mining companies have to do a better job at interacting with host communities, as this one example here shows. I did spend a lot of time for the chapter on Freeport at Morenci, which is the largest mine for any metal of any type in the North American continent. It's massive, words escape me at this point. Just the first time that I saw it, it was just crazy and big. But Freeport, I would say, and I discovered this during the reporting, put in the work to interact with host communities, to really say, how can we be a good neighbor? And I wanted that to reflect in the book. And that's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of many people that I spoke to. And there's other examples in the book beyond the North Carolina one of mining companies having tension with host communities. And one of the things I did notice, Richard, is you obviously live this every single day, but the average person just doesn't realize the scale of some of these mines. I'd like to, if it's okay with you, maybe just read one or two paragraphs from the chapter on Morenci, just to give people a flavor for the size.
It's your show.
Of this. So this is Morenci. The mine itself appears from high above as if it is arrayed in a long, narrow pattern that evokes a map of the mythical land of Westeros from Game of Thrones, with leach pads, tailing ponds, and other repositories at the mine's southern end, and its vast open pits dotting the north. each one dipping deeper into the earth in gradual slopes marked by small terraces of land known as benches that narrow every 20 feet or so until reaching the bottom of the pit. Each day, the mine's fleet of 154 mining trucks moves 1.8 billion pounds of rock, with each truck bed capable of carrying more than 500,000 pounds per load. As recently as the 1970s, the company had used trains rather than trucks inside the mine pits. Those trucks and shovels, drills, and other equipment helped Morenci and its 3,600 workers dig into 3 types of mineralization at the copper deposit. That's basically a geological way of saying how the copper appears in the rock. Much of the copper at the Morenci deposit is considered low grade, ranging somewhere between 0.23 and 0.5%. That means for every 100 pounds of rock, those trucks move about a quarter to half a, that means for every 100 pounds of rock that those trucks move, about a quarter to half a pound is copper. I mean, to me, that just shows the sheer scale of the operation and just the person power that's needed to produce the copper that we use every single day.
So this ore deposit was discovered by U.S. cavalryman Chase and Cochise back in the 1870s. They camped out by a stream. They noticed mineral staining in the stream. After they left the service, they got a concession on it, which was very easy to get, and then they went up the west coast, up the east coast, and got financing from the company we acquired in Phoenix called Phelps Dodge Company. And we have a huge mine in Peru. It's the largest concentrator in the world, and we move over 1 million tons of rock every day. That's equivalent of like 200 or 300 street dump trucks every hour. I mean, it's just amazing. The scale of it, it's not that complicated, but the scale is just incredibly dead. Now let's transition from that. And we have, another big difference is the difference between a greenfield mine and a
brand new mine, greenfield mine.
Brownfield mine, one that's been there. By being there, if you do it right, you work hard with the local community, with the workforce, with state governments, federal governments. But starting a new mine is totally different. We have great relationships with the San Carlos Apache group. That's important tribal group. It was several Apache tribes when they were settling them on reservations there. And since World War II, we've had a water agreement with them. We built a training facility for them. We hire them. Chief Rambler and a good friend, and they're very supportive.
I could just give a little context there as to why you mentioned the San Carlos Apache. I think for those that might not be too familiar, Richard.
That's where I'm going to.
Okay.
I'm setting it up. So that's one situation.
Basketball analogy. Yeah.
Now, in an area where we've had historical operations, there's an undeveloped massive ore body called Resolution, just east of Phoenix. And they've been working on this for 10 or 15 years. And it is co-owned by a UK-Australian company named Rio Tinto, which was our partner in Indonesia, and BHP, the largest company in Australia. And so pick it up, because these are not very far apart.
Yeah.
But totally different ore bodies, and the timing of it is different.
For me, this is such an intractable situation. I actually made it the longest chapter in the book. So this copper deposit at the Resolution site, which is about an hour east of Phoenix that Richard was referring to, it's about 1 mile or 2 underground. And there was a land swap that occurred in 2014 as part of a massive Pentagon funding bill that would allow these 2 companies Richard was referring to access to the land, basically swapping land the federal government owned that contained the copper for land they own nearby. There was some steps that needed to be taken in order for that project to move forward, and that land swap to move forward, but the law did give the companies the ability to basically drill a mine shaft at the site on a very small sliver part of land, and that's what they did. And so there's a mine shaft there today, but they don't have access to the full deposit. Part of the reason that they don't is because not long after taking office, President Biden undid something that President Trump did at the end of his first term, where he actually pushed that land swap through. It's a little complex, but basically it's been sitting on ice for the past 5 or 6 years since that move was taken. Now, why is there all this tension here? Because at the surface of that land is a site where the San Carlos Apache people worship their deities, where they hold coming-of-age ceremonies for teenage girls, where they go to pray and dance and have other special ceremonies.
And this has been going on for
Time immemorial.
Right.
Yes, yes. The problem, though, is that the way that the companies would extract the copper, it's 2 miles underground. The first question you might ask is, well, why can't they just take the copper out and, then leave the land on the surface fine? Everyone will be, hunky-dory. The problem is that they would basically use a type of mining that would create a giant crater on the surface of the land, what's known in the mining industry as a glory hole. That is actually what it's called. And so the tension here, of course, is that if you're going to basically swallow that site where the San Carlos Apache people worship their deities and hold these very important ceremonies for them, they couldn't do that anymore. And so there's been this big tension from the very beginning. Okay, well, what matters more here? Do the indigenous rights of the San Carlos Apache people, do they matter? Or should we care more about getting this important metal for the industrial and the electrification of our modern lives? And sitting at the Supreme Court right now, the Supreme Court may or may not decide to actually take the case. We'll find out before June. But for me, regardless of what actually happens with this project, is the question of what do we value more? And I don't think that's sort of a philosophical question we as people think about a lot, especially because we need a lot more copper, as Richard was referring to. We have to get it from somewhere. We're certainly seeing that China is willing to use its control of all critical minerals, including copper, as an economic weapon. So where should we actually get this copper from? And so that's what I wanted to actually explore here a little bit with this chapter of the book. Now, but the tribe itself won't talk to the mining companies, because they say they favor what's known as government-to-government consultation. And so the CEO of the mining company actually goes to Arizona, and I interviewed him for the book, and he tries to basically meet with the leaders of the San Carlos Apache who say, no, I mean, if President Biden or Vice President Harris want to come, we'll talk to them, but we won't talk to you because our treaty is with the US federal government. So I think that gives a little bit of color here as to some of the tension points.
And coincidentally, how many years ago? 6, 7 years ago, in Western Australia, which is iron ore mining country, this same company, Rio Tinto, had a permit, but accidentally destroyed this cave system for the indigenous people in Australia. Yeah. And it created such a furor in the way that they handled it that the CEO was terminated.
Lost his job. The chairman was pushed out of the board.
The chairman was pushed out of the board. And now this is providing fuel to the opposition here in the United States, saying, here's a company that's shown that they are not sensitive to these sorts of things. And Chairman Rambler, the head of the San Carlos Apache, you said they won't talk to all mining companies, they talk with us. But
well, I think, yeah, I mean, that's...
I understand what you're saying. And
you guys have a water agreement with them, which...
We have a water agreement, we have training facilities.
That was a business, so I asked the chairman about this. He said this is a business deal that we made of our own volition, which I think gets back to the idea of tribal sovereignty and...
But to show you the strong feelings, and we stay out of this because we need to be friends with Rio Tinto and also with the San Carlos Apaches. But I have these really beautiful copper plates that I give to people after meetings. And after our meeting with him, I said, I have a gift for you. He opened it up. He looked at his copper, and he just pushed it right back at me. And so it's incredible, the strength of feelings. And that's one of the good thing about the book. They talk about those projects, which I'm very familiar with. But we made a strategic decision to really focus on copper. We're not involved in specialty metals or other things. And I'd read about all these projects. But what Ernie does so well is he goes into these projects that I had read about and knew something about being in the industry, but reports then about those kinds of conflicts. This is one example, the North Carolina deal, which my family was small farmers in West Tennessee, and I can relate to, how they would feel if a big mine comes into their that kind of country and that sort of thing. It's one thing for it to be in Nevada or rural Arizona. It's another thing to be in a situation like that. But that's what this book does so well. It gives you the facts of the situation. It talks about the opposition. It talks about the companies trying to do it, and it talks about the policy need to develop these deals. And that's what we're seeing today is a big push to try to encourage development in the U.S. But it just takes so long, even if they do cut permits down. It just takes so long to do it.
Yeah, one of the things that I really wanted to hone in on in the book was, as you say, the stories about people and community. I didn't want my opinion to actually come through here, and that's not just because my day job is as a journalist. I could have put my opinion in the book, mining good or bad, but what I wanted to do is to introduce you to people on all sides of these situations, find out what makes them tick, and then have you decide what you would do. The rare flower example that we were talking about earlier, I spent a lot of time with the chairman of the company that would like to develop it, this Australian mining company. He's an American, he lives in the United States. He used to be in oil and gas for years. His dad was in oil and gas, his brother was in oil and gas. In fact, when he was born, his father gave him the middle name Derek, as in oil Derek. Seriously, you can't make this stuff up. And so he was in oil and gas for years, made a lot of money, but then had a bit of a road to Damascus moment where he said, what am I doing with my life? I can't continue to produce oil and gas if it's having a deleterious effect on the planet. And so he went into lithium mining. He developed a big lithium project in Argentina that was actually just bought by Rio Tinto, and then he retired. But then he was like, we're gonna need a lot more of this metal in the United States, and especially with this coming electrification wave. And so he discovered this deposit and got on with some Australians and decided to invest in it. And so for him, it's not just about making money. The guy, in his telling, has more than enough money. What he wanted to do was to develop this project to fight climate change, to basically atone for his oil-producing past, in his words. And so for him, it's almost a religious type of project that he really, really wants to get this developed. So you get to see what makes him tick in the narrative. On the other side, I spent a lot of time with a conservationist, with an environmental group that is saying this flower matters. It might be small, it might only be in this one spot of Nevada and nowhere else on the planet, but if we let it go extinct, if we let this lithium mine get developed here, what does that say about our values as humans? What's next? A tree, a forest, a type of people, a species? Where do you draw the line? And so you get to understand what makes him tick as well. The two men actually never meet, which to me I find very, very fascinating. But you get to see all sides of these issues, and you get to really get inside their heads in the book. And for me, that was a true honor and joy as the author to be able to tell their story so that you, the audience, the reader, can say, gosh, what matters more, the flower or the lithium?
Yeah. Let's talk about climate change a bit. And that's obviously public opinion's changing on it. It was the early 70s that started the process leading to the Paris Accords. Now the U.S. government's just withdrawn from the Paris Accords.
For the second time.
For the second time. Climate change is real. All of us, I still have a home in New Orleans, and all of us here worry about the effects of the increased frequency and severity of hurricanes. The city certainly saw it about the time we moved out. We didn't move out because of that, by the way. And then out west, forest fires are just unbelievable. The devastation in Los Angeles, I'm friends with the CEO of Edison International, and their power lines started one of those fires. And we know people who live out there. It was worse than Katrina. It's just a disaster. And, it's just around us all the time, the smoke and everything. So the people who downplay climate change, have reasons for it, but it's real. And there was a big movement among companies in the mining industry. We have an international organization that I was chair of, and all these companies were making commitments about reaching carbon targets, from the different elements and how do you define that and everything. and there's a big move away from oil and gas investors. Reality is set in. I mean, the world is going to need petroleum for a long time. It's not going to go away. But that doesn't mean there should be an us versus them issue between investments and climate change. Now, talking my own book here, because electric cars have 3 or 4 times more copper in them than regular cars, and wind and solar has 3 or 4 more times copper in them than traditional generation of energy. But these metals that you're talking about are critical for that. They can't occur without it. And so talk about your perspectives on how climate change is affecting these discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly you can't have a conversation about electrification or about more sourcing of any of these critical minerals without talking about climate change. I mean, to Richard's point, the climate obviously is changing. We know it. We see it every single day. So the conversation is, what do we do about it? And I think a lot of people say go green. But what does going green actually mean? And so what I wanted to do with this book is sort of peel back a few layers of that onion and sort of expose you to what some of the choices are if we have to go green. We obviously need to have more mining for the foreseeable future. What does it look like to demand more from the mining industry, to say your standards need to be higher? Do you need to have better engagement with host communities, as we were discussing earlier? We need to know what you think about biodiversity, about Indigenous consultation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is all part of the conversation. I have a huge chapter in the book on recycling for obvious reasons, because obviously we're going to need to recycle a lot more. Now, when we combust oil or natural gas in an engine, obviously it's gone forever. You can't get it back, and then it contributes to climate change. But metals can be reused again and again and again. Lithium does not lose its ability to retain an electric charge just because it's been sitting in a battery for 20 years. So you can reuse it again and again. Now, we all got to be recycling more. There's no way around it. I mean, I won't take a poll of the audience, but I'll share a little secret with you. I have a drawer at home filled with 5 old cell phones. I'm sure many of you do too. If I took a poll, many of you would. Now, that's the biggest mine in the world is in your kitchen drawer. I mean, seriously, what would it mean for us to be recycling a lot more of these old devices and to really encourage that? Now, at some point, we're going to get to what's known as a truly circular economy, where we're not going to have to mine anymore. Some people think that's 2050. I suspect Richard thinks it's farther out than 2050. I certainly think it's going to be farther out than 2050. But what we do know is that we have to be recycling more, especially as we talk about climate change, and especially as we talk about all of these electronic devices that we use every single day in our homes. And so by encouraging you to think through this in the chapter that I have on recycling, you get to meet the CEOs of 2 companies that are trying to start recycling ventures. You find out what happens to them at the end of the book. But they're trying to encourage more people to recycle, and they're also trying to get the really complex systems and plants needed to recycle built in the United States. Now, if people don't want to mine in their backyard, they definitely don't want a giant recycling plant next door. And so this is part of the choice here as well that I bring to the reader. So to your point, Richard, yes, I mean, I think there's a lot that has to happen on the recycling side. As a minor anecdote, so if you have an internal combustion engine right now, when the battery dies in there, it's a lead acid battery. So you go get a new battery. But what you don't know is there's a small cost added onto that battery that funds this entire system behind the scenes that you'll never go to, you never see, but that funds basically a recycling for all lead acid batteries in the United States. And that was due to an act of Congress years ago. What would it look like to have some kind of standardization for recycling of lithium-ion batteries? There are many, many different types now. It's the Wild West. Manufacturers are making different types all the time with weird acronyms like NCA, NCM, that mean basically the type and percentage of metals that are in there. But what would it look like to have some kind of standardization and some kind of maybe fee for a behind-the-scenes system for lithium-ion battery recycling? It happens a lot, certainly with copper. I grew up in Maine, and every time the price of copper went up, we knew it because people would break into houses and steal copper pipes. So what would it look like to encourage more people to recycle? I think that's intrinsically linked to how we fight climate change.
It is. An example of that was I moved to Houston right after the fall of the Shah of Iran in the late 70s. The price of oil spiked to over $100 a barrel after being for years at $3 a barrel from World War II up until the Mideast boycott. I mean, in the early 70s. And a lot of Houston was built on the premise of $100 barrel oil. Well, $100 hit, price of gasoline went out of sight. Nobody took into account conservation. That people start driving smaller, much more fuel-efficient cars, and that changed. So as we run into shortages, and I'll just use copper as an example, prices are going to rise, but that's going to encourage not only recycling, which will be an important part of it, but conservation. People will work to find out how to use less copper for applications than they would when prices were lower. It will also trigger substitution. You know, China's taking steps now to how to use aluminum. By the way, I did tell the CEO of Edison that they have these aluminum high wires and they fall and they create forest fires. If you took copper cables and buried it, you wouldn't have some of these fires.
Did he bite? Did you make a sale?
Yeah, because he was pretty shell-shocked about what they were facing out there. But all of these things will happen. And of course, it'll be more technology. We were using technology to recover more copper out of our ore bodies and our waste stacks than we are now. Learning how to be more efficient. The mines in the U.S. are very low grade because they're so old. With mines, you mine the highest grade first, and then as mines expand, inevitably grades drop. And our average cost of production in the U.S. is like 3 times what it is internationally. So we have to be much more efficient in the way we do that. So there'll be all these effects that'll be happening together. And people who try to simplify it too much, say we're going to get to, you know, 0 Scope 3 emissions by 2050, you know, that's not the world, because the world will constantly change.
I mean, there's no free lunch, I think, and that was one of the themes that I really wanted to talk about in the book. It's going green, as I've said, means different things to different people, but it doesn't just mean, oh, we're going to get rid of oil and gas completely. To Richard's point, oil and gas will be with us for a very, very long time, but we know that increasingly we're going to be using a lot more materials to build the products that we use every single day. So where do they come from, and how do we actually get them out of the ground? And yes, substitution is part of it. Recycling is part of it. Substitution might happen for some metals, but we're still going to need metals. And so to me, the overarching idea here is one of choice, that we've got to really, really be having these conversations. We're not having them right now. I mean, when's the last time you talked to your elected representative about mining in the United States?
Last week.
Present company excluded.
But yeah, and it's, you know, the history of mining is really tough. This week I was in Butte, Montana, speaking to students and faculty of Montana Tech. And the city of Butte has the largest Superfund site in the world. And to see how that's changed, all through the West you go. We're working with Trout Unlimited to try to clear up abandoned mine sites and things like that. The oil and gas industry has its own issues with its historical operations, as we see in the Gulf. I see a T-shirt back there that says Gulf of Mexico. I thought that was gone.
Hang on to that.
So, but all the companies, the chairman of ConocoPhillips is on our board, and he was with me. He's a graduate of Montana Tech. And all the companies now are much more responsible about what they're doing. You know, they're finding, all of us are finding ways of reducing carbon emissions. And it's hard. I mean, you know, these big haul trucks that you're talking about are diesel haul trucks, and we're working with suppliers like Caterpillar to see if we can design an electric system. The batteries in those systems weigh like 9 tons. Which has to be hauled too with the material. So all these things, but everybody's working towards it. Nobody is saying it's not a problem. And so it's something that's going to be part of all of our futures going forward.
I definitely agree, and I would say that the more that we have these conversations, the more that the book sparks dialogue among you and your families. I mean, I think the better. You know, I mean, what would it look like at Easter or, you know, Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner to say, hey, like, let's talk about mining? Like, seriously. Like, you know, I mean, people love to disparage other parts of the industry, you know. Talk about, I mean, you can't have AI, you can't have the latest Apple, you can't have a Tesla without mining, And what does it look like to demand more, to ask what are the best standards that minds should operate on, to have these conversations among everyday people? And that was really the goal that I wanted to bring, that I wanted to achieve with the book.
And you did a great job. AI, we didn't even touch on that, but that's huge addition to metals demand.
Yeah, you need a lot of copper for AI.
We're going to shut down here in 22 seconds. Ernie's going to be signing and selling his books. Nobody sold more of his books than I have in the past year and a half. I send them to everybody. Yeah, I'll take you up on that. So anyway, thank you all for coming. It's great being here with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.